Some secrets are too heavy to stay buried. When the Summit Plaza collapsed in 1999, it took the truth down with it. Now, as the new Aurelia Grand begins construction, investigator Bennett Crowe uncovers a digital trail of corruption, red ink ledgers, and a structural anomaly that changes everything we knew about that fatal night. The Paper Architect, a story by 10 Chapters Audiobooks. Chapter 1, The Blueprint of a Ghost. The coffee in Bennett Crowe's mug was cold, but the data on his screen was finally heating up. Outside his window, the city was a blur of gray rain and neon, but Crowe's world was a 4K rendering of a tragedy from 1999. It was the Summit Plaza collapse. 10 dead, a city in mourning, and one man, Julian Vane, the lead architect, who had vanished into the night before the sirens had even stopped screaming. The world called him a coward, who fled his own failure. Crowe didn't care about the world's opinion. He cared about the physics. He adjusted his position in his chair, a dull ache blooming in his right leg, a gift from a career that had taken more than it gave. He ignored it. He leaned in, his eyes tracking the structural metadata he'd spent 3 weeks scraping from archive city servers. "You didn't run, Julian," Crowe whispered to the empty room. "You couldn't have." The doorbell rang, sharp and intrusive. Crowe didn't get visitors at 2 a.m. He stood, his limp subtle but present, and moved to the door. Standing there was Elena Marquez, a regional investigator for a high-limit insurance firm. She looked like she hadn't slept since the turn of the millennium. "I found the original logs, Bennett," she said, skipping the greeting. She handed him a weathered USB drive, the ones the demolition crew tried to wipe before the new foundation was poured last month. "Come in, Elena. The jazz is better than the weather." He led her into the office, a space where paper files lived in uneasy truce with high-end servers. He plugged the drive in. "They're calling it a clean start for the city," Elena said, watching the screen. "Building a new luxury hotel on the old Summit site." But when they started digging for the new pilings, the sensors picked up something anomalous. Crowe's fingers flew across the keys. He wasn't looking at the new blueprints. He was looking at the ground-penetrating radar scans. The city ruled that the 1999 collapse was due to Vane's negligent use of substandard steel in the support columns. They said he took a kickback from the supplier and bolted when the weight became too much. That was the story, Elena agreed. Case closed for 27 years. "Look at the stress point metadata," Crowe said, pointing to a jagged red line on the graph. "If Vane had used bad steel, the collapse would have been symmetrical. The building would have pancaked, but the data shows a microsecond delay in the failure of the southwest corner." "That wasn't a structural failure, Elena." He paused, his deadpan expression hardening. "It was a subtraction." Elena frowned. "A subtraction? You mean an explosion?" "No," Crowe said, his voice dropping an octave. "I mean someone removed a key variable from the equation while the building was still standing. And then they removed the man who wrote the equation." He pulled up a 3D model of the debris field. Using an AI-driven reconstruction tool, he began to piece the digital rubble back together. As the building rose on the screen, a ghostly wireframe of the 1999 tragedy, he highlighted a void in the basement level, a space that didn't match the original blueprints. "The police searched the ruins for weeks," Elena said. "They never found Julian Vane. They assumed he caught a flight to South America before the dust settled." "They were looking for a man who escaped," Crowe said, his dry wit cutting through the tension. "They should have been looking for a man who became part of the architecture." He tapped a specific point on the basement scan, a density anomaly encased in 20 feet of reinforced concrete. "The new construction crew hit a pocket of air yesterday, a void in the foundation that shouldn't be there. They thought it was a gas leak. They stopped digging." Elena leaned in, her breath catching. "You think he's in there?" "I think Julian Vane didn't flee the crime scene," Crowe said. "I think he is the crime scene." He reached for his coat, the heavy wool smelling of old books and rain. He didn't need to see the rest of the files. The data had whispered its first secret. and Crowe was the only one who knew how to listen. "We're going to the site, Elena." "The site is a restricted zone, Bennett. There are sensors, security, and a city council that wants that hotel built yesterday." Crowe grabbed his keys, a faint, dangerous glint in his eyes. "Then it's a good thing I've spent the last decade learning how to move through shadows, both digital and physical." He walked toward the door, the rhythm of his step, thump, click, echoing in the quiet hallway. 10 people died because that building fell," Crowe said, his hand on the knob. "But an 11th person died to make sure we never knew why. It's time to show the city that concrete has a very long memory." Chapter 2. The Sound of Solid Ground. The construction site for the new Aurelia Grand was a jagged wound in the center of the city's skyline, illuminated by the harsh, artificial glare of halogen work lights that turned the falling mist into a shroud of glowing ghosts. From the street, it looked like a triumph of progress, a billion-dollar promise to forget the tragedy of 1999. But to Bennett Crowe, standing in the shadows of a shuttered warehouse across the street, it looked like a burial mound that had been disturbed too soon. He parked his sedan 2 blocks away, tucked into a narrow alley where the streetlights had been smashed long ago. He didn't want the car's plates caught on the high-definition perimeter cameras of the site. Beside him, Elena Marquez sat in a silence that was thick with hesitation. She was watching the towering cranes that clawed at the night sky, like the skeletal fingers of a buried giant. "The site is monitored by Aegis security," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic thump-thump of a distant pile driver. "They don't just use guards. They have thermal drones on a randomized flight path and seismic sensors buried every 50 feet along the fence line. If we so much as trip over a stray piece of rebar, the city police will be here in under 4 minutes. My firm has a contract with them. I know how fast they move." Crowe didn't look worried. He pulled a slim, modified tablet from the inner pocket of his coat. The screen's glow cast sharp, blue angles across his face, highlighting the deep lines of a man who spent more time with data than with people. "Every modern security system has a heartbeat, Elena, a digital pulse. You just have to find the rhythm and learn how to step between the beats." His fingers danced over the screen with a practiced, surgical precision. He wasn't trying to hack the system in the cinematic sense. He was performing a man-in-the-middle interception. He found the local Wi-Fi handshakes of the security hub and initiated a packet injection. He wasn't breaking the cameras. He was simply convincing the central server that the feed from camera 4, the one covering the southwest excavation pit, was a seamless looping video of an empty, rain-slicked corner. "There," Crowe said, his voice a dry, melodic rasp. "We have a 10-minute window before the server runs a parity check and realizes the footage is a ghost. It's not much, but it's more than Julian Vane ever had." He stepped out of the car, the cold dampness of the Oregon night immediately biting through his wool coat. As he moved toward the chain-link fence, his right leg gave a sharp, familiar twinge, a dull ache that radiated from the old break up to his hip. He didn't slow down. He'd lived with the pain for so long, it was less of an ailment and more of a compass, a physical reminder of the last time he'd let his guard down. It kept him honest. It kept him sharp. They slipped through a gap in the fencing near the old utility lines, where the shadows were deepest. The ground inside was a treacherous slurry of mud, oil, and gravel. Below them lay the pit, a massive rectangular maw where the new foundation pilings were being driven into the earth. At the very bottom, tucked away from the main construction lights, was the anomalous zone. "The workers call it the dead spot," Elena said, as they descended the temporary wooden stairs, which creaked precariously under their weight. "The drills kept overheating here. The foreman thought they'd hit an old granite shelf, but the ground-penetrating radar returned a reading that didn't make sense. It showed solid concrete, but with a perfectly symmetrical hollow center, like a bubble in a lung." Crowe reached the bottom and knelt in the muck. He didn't look at the massive machinery or the yellow excavators that loomed over them like sleeping predators. He looked at the old concrete, the gray, jagged remains of the 1999 foundation that had never been fully removed. He pulled a small ultrasonic scanner from his kit. a device normally used for checking the integrity of aircraft wings, and pressed it against the cold, wet surface. The official NTSB report from 1999 said Julian Vane used grade 3 concrete, where the blueprints strictly called for grade 5. Crowe murmured, his eyes fixed on the oscillating waves on his tablet. The narrative was simple. He skimmed the budget, used the cheap stuff, and the building crumbled under its own weight when the tremors hit. He moved the scanner 6 inches to the left. The frequency on the screen didn't just rise. It spiked into a sharp, jagged peak. "But this isn't grade 3, he said, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. "This is high-density, industrial, polymer-reinforced concrete. It's the kind of material they use for bank vaults and nuclear bunkers. It doesn't crumble. It doesn't age. It lasts forever." "Why would an architect who's supposed to be stealing money use the most expensive material on the market?" Elena asked, leaning over his shoulder. "He didn't," Crowe said. "Someone else poured this. They poured it after the building fell. They didn't just clear the rubble back then. They entombed a specific section of the basement. They poured $1 billion lid on top of a secret, then spent 27 years telling the world the architect was a thief." Crowe stood up, his joints protesting the movement, and looked at a nearby piling, a massive steel pillar that had been driven halfway into the earth before the crew had been ordered to stop. The steel was bent at the tip, mangled as if it had struck something impenetrable, and alien deep in the soil. "Julian Vane was a meticulous man," Crowe continued, his voice reflecting the respect one craftsman has for another. His digital footprint showed a man obsessed with redundancy. He didn't just design buildings, he designed puzzles. If he knew someone was tampering with his materials, he wouldn't have just run away. He would have left a record, a structural insurance policy. Crowe tapped the concrete with the butt of his heavy flashlight. The sound wasn't the hollow ring of a pipe or the sharp crack of stone. It was a dull, heavy thud that felt like it was absorbing the light itself. "And if you're a man who knows he's about to be erased from history," Crowe said, "where do you hide the truth? You hide it in the one place no one would think to look, inside the failure itself." Suddenly, the tablet in Crowe's pocket vibrated. A crimson alert flashed across the screen. The security hub was initiating its parity check early. The ghost loop was about to dissolve. "We're out of time," Crowe said, his tone remaining perfectly flat, even as the distant sound of a gate sliding open echoed through the pit. "The system is waking up, Bennett. We have to go. Now." "Wait." Crowe wasn't looking at the exit. He was looking at the bent steel piling. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing away a layer of wet silt and grit from the side of the pillar. There, etched into the steel with the precise charred lines of a welder's torch, was a tiny, intricate symbol. It was a compass rose, beautifully rendered, but with a single petal missing on the southwest axis. "What is that?" Elena asked, her eyes darting toward the flickering searchlights on the perimeter. "It's Vane's signature," Crowe said, snapping a high-resolution photo. "But the missing petal, that's not a mistake. It's a vector. It's a pointer. Vane didn't just leave a record. He left a map." A siren wailed, the low, guttural moan of a private security vehicle. The lights on the fence began to sweep the pit in wide, predatory arcs. "Crowe," Elena urged, grabbing his arm. "I have it," he said, tucking the tablet away. They scrambled back up the stairs, Crowe's limp becoming a rhythmic hitch as he pushed his pace. They reached the fence just as a white security SUV rounded the corner, its searchlight cutting through the mist like a blade. They rolled under the gap in the chain link and stayed low in the shadows of a parked dumpster, their breath coming in ragged plumes of white in the cold air. The SUV slowed, its light lingering on the very spot they had just vacated, illuminating the dead spot in a stark, unforgiving white. After a tense minute that felt like an hour, the vehicle moved on. Crowe leaned back against the brick wall of a nearby warehouse, his breath steadying, his mind already miles away. He wasn't thinking about the guards. He was crunching the geometry of the compass rose. "That wasn't just a signature," Crowe said, looking at the photo on his screen. Vane knew the building was going to fall before it ever happened. He knew who was doing it, and he knew that one day someone would come looking for the man they called a coward. He looked at Elena, the cold light of the screen reflecting in his sharp, observant eyes. Tomorrow, we find out what that coordinate points to, and I suspect the city's clean start is about to get very, very dirty. Chapter 3. The Ghost in the Machine. The missing pedal of the compass rose wasn't a mistake. It was a vector. Back in the sanctuary of his office, the air was thick with the scent of bitter coffee and the hum of high-end cooling fans. Crowe had spent the last 3 hours mapping the coordinates. They didn't point to a secret bunker, a buried chest, or a safety deposit box. They pointed to a specific server rack in a decommissioned data center in the city's industrial district, a facility known as the Vault. It had been frozen in time since 2004, trapped in a legal stalemate between the city and a defunct tech firm that had once handled the municipality's most sensitive infrastructure logs. Vane was a pioneer of early CAD software, Crowe explained to Elena. He sat hunched over a keyboard that looked like a relic from the late 90s, but its mechanical switches clicked with a satisfying high-speed rhythm. In 1999, everyone was panicked about Y2K, worried that the world would end because a clock couldn't roll over. Vane was worried about something much more permanent: deletion. He knew that if he kept his data on a personal drive, it would be seized. If he put it in the cloud, it would be erased. So he hid it in plain sight. The vault hasn't had a human visitor in 20 years, Elena said, leaning against the edge of a mahogany desk piled high with structural journals. The city cut the fiber lines to that building during the 2008 budget crisis. They cut the main lines, Crowe corrected, his voice a low, dry rasp. But the city's old emergency broadcast network, the one they built during the Cold War, still uses the copper subterranean conduits. Vane knew that. He didn't just design buildings, he understood the nervous system of the city. Crowe wasn't just typing, he was listening. He had a pair of high-fidelity headphones around his neck, and on his secondary monitor, he was running a modern AI upscaling tool on a grainy 27-year-old security video of the Summit Plaza lobby. It was the last known footage of the building before it became a tomb. "What are we looking for, Bennett?" Elena asked, handing him a fresh cup of coffee, black as ink. "A shadow," Crowe said. Julian Vane disappeared 2 hours before the collapse. But the server logs from the city's central hub show that someone, using Vane's unique encrypted key, logged into the building's central maintenance server 10 minutes after the first tremor was recorded. After? Elena's brow furrowed. The building was literally falling down. People were screaming, running for the exits. Who stays inside to check their email while the ceiling is cracking? Someone who isn't checking email. Someone who is uploading a patch to the history books. Crowe hit a key, and the AI upscaled video sharpened. The pixels smoothed out, revealing the chaotic lobby of the Summit Plaza. People were blurred streaks of panic, but in the corner of the frame, near the service elevator, a figure moved with a chilling, mechanical steadiness. It was a man in a high-visibility vest, but he wasn't carrying a hard hat or an emergency kit. He was carrying a ruggedized laptop, a bulky, rare piece of tech for 1999. Crowe paused the frame. The man's face was still obscured by the low-resolution bloom of the overhead lights, but he had a distinctive, jerky gait, a hitch in his step that suggested a back injury or a poorly healed break. He wasn't looking at the crumbling plaster. He was looking at his watch. "Look at the way he moves," Crowe murmured, his own right leg throbbing in a sympathetic, dull rhythm. "He's not panicked. He's counting. He's timed the collapse to the second. He was there to ensure the failure was total. He was deleting the real-time sensor data that would have proven the building was sabotaged from the inside out." "Is that Vane?" "No," Crowe said. Julian Vane was a runner, a dreamer. This man is a technician, a cleaner. He was there to burn the digital evidence, while the physical evidence was being crushed into dust. The primary monitor chirped, a sharp digital bird call. The connection to the old data center was live. Crowe had bypassed the dead fiber lines by piggybacking on an old page data frequency used by the city's water department. Vane knew his keys had been stolen, Crowe continued, his eyes reflecting the green text scrolling down the screen. So he built a mirror, a digital black box, hidden in a hidden partition of the city's old zoning server. He knew that if he tried to go to the police, the data would be wiped before he reached the station. But if he hid it in the one place the city never updates, the archives, it would wait. It would wait for someone who knew where to look. A progress bar crawled across the screen. Decrypting, the pedal on the piling, Elena realized, her voice dropping to a whisper. It wasn't a map to a place. It was a physical password for a digital lock. Precisely. It's a 12-point geometric key. The missing pedal represents the 225-degree coordinate. If I hadn't seen the piling, I'd be guessing for 1,000 years. The bar hit 100%. A single file appeared. It wasn't a blueprint or a spreadsheet. It was a high-fidelity audio file, preserved in a format that had been obsolete since the turn of the millennium. Crowe pressed play. The sound was thick with the hiss of a microcassette recorder, a ghost's voice struggling to be heard through the static of decades. This is Julian Vane. It's October 14th, 1999. I have 40 minutes before the shift changes. If you're hearing this, the plaza is gone, and I'm likely gone with it. I didn't take the money, and I didn't cut the corners. I found the discrepancy in the southwest pilings. Someone swapped the reinforced steel for hollow core decoys. When I raised it with the deputy mayor's office, they didn't call for an inspection. They called a cleaner named Arthur Vance. If you want the truth, look at the signature on the subcontract for the foundation pour. It's not a company, it's a name. It's the name of the man who owns the city's silence. The recording cut out into a sharp electronic squeal. The deputy mayor's office. Elena's voice was trembling. Bennett, the current senator, Elias Thorne. He was the deputy mayor in 1999. He built his entire career on the Summit Resilience Act. He's the one who authorized the billion-dollar Aurelia Grand project. Thorne wasn't just rebuilding the city, Crowe said, his gaze fixed on the digital waveform on the screen. It looked like a jagged mountain range. He was harvesting it. He turned a mass casualty event into a political ladder, and Julian Vane was the only one who saw the rungs were made of bone. Crowe leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. He looked at the window, where the rain continued to wash against the glass, blurring the city into a smear of gray and neon. Vane didn't just leave a recording, Elena. He mentioned a name, Arthur Vance, the man who poured the dead spot in the foundation. If Arthur Vance was the cleaner, then his records are the ledger of every lie Thorne ever told. But Vance is dead, Elena said. He died 3 years ago. His company was dissolved. A man dies, Crowe said, his voice flat and final. But a man like that never throws away his insurance. He would have kept a red folder, something to keep the deputy mayor from ever turning on him. Crowe stood up, his limp subtle but present as he reached for his coat. We need to find Martha Vance, Arthur's widow. If the truth isn't in the concrete, and it's not in the servers, it's in the one place people always forget to look, the family secrets. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Silence. By the following afternoon, the city's persistent drizzle had thickened into a heavy, rhythmic downpour that turned the suburbs into a landscape of charcoal and slate. Crowe stood across the street from a narrow 3-story building that seemed to be shrinking between its modern neighbors. The ground floor housed a funeral home with a faded gilt sign. The upper floors were draped in heavy velvet curtains. This was the residence of Martha Vance. Her husband, Arthur, had been the city's preferred structural specialist for 3 decades, a title that was a polite euphemism for a man who knew exactly how to make a building disappear, whether by crane or by corruption. She won't talk to us, Elena warned, as they sat in the car, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the deluge. The press hounded her for years after the Summit collapse, and the families of the victims filed enough lawsuits to keep her in depositions until she's 100. She's a fortress. I'm not going to ask her about the victims, Crowe said, checking the charge on his tablet. And I'm not the press. I'm a man who understands the weight of a secret. Secrets are like structural loads, Elena. Eventually, the person carrying them just wants to set them down before the whole floor gives way. He stepped out of the car, his right leg protesting the cold dampness. with a sharp, familiar bite. He didn't approach the front door of the funeral home. Instead, he navigated the side alley to a private entrance, his limp echoing against the brick walls. He didn't knock like a solicitor. He used 3 measured, authoritative strikes, the kind that signaled the arrival of someone who already knew what was behind the door. The door opened only 6 inches, held by a heavy brass security chain. Martha Vance was a woman constructed of porcelain and iron, her face a map of grief that had long since hardened into defiance. Her eyes, sharp and clouded with suspicion, scanned Crowe from his worn boots to his observant gaze. "I have nothing for the city, and even less for the lawyers," she said, her voice like dry parchment. "I'm not here for a statement, Mrs. Vance," Crowe said, his voice dropping into a low, respectful register. "I'm here because of the Southwest discrepancy. I know about the hollow core steel, and I know your husband didn't choose it. He was handed a blueprint in red ink, and he was told to make it work." The woman's hand tightened on the doorframe until her knuckles turned white. The mention of the red ink, a surveyor's shorthand for unofficial, high-level changes, acted like a skeleton key. "My husband was a craftsman," she whispered, her defiance flickering. "He was caught in a tide that was moving too fast for anyone to swim against." "A tide started by Elias Thorne," Crowe added. The name hit the air like a physical weight. Martha's gaze flickered toward a small, locked mahogany cabinet in the hallway behind her. It was a tell so obvious, it was almost tragic. "Arthur was a pragmatist," Martha said, her voice trembling now. "He knew he was being groomed as the scapegoat if the resilience plan ever turned sour. He told me once that if a man ever came asking about a missing pedal, I should tell him to look at the shadows of the blueprints. He said the truth isn't in what they built, but in the space they left behind." "The shadows?" Crowe asked, leaning in. "The original blueprints were double-layered," Martha explained, finally unhooking the chain and allowing him into the narrow, dimly lit foyer. The air smelled of beeswax and old lilac. The top layer was the Julian Vane design, the dream, but the bottom layer, the one hidden in the chemical blue of the paper, was the graft. It was a map of every utility easement and fiber optic trunk line that Thorne sold off before the foundation was even dry. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small, tarnished silver key. She didn't hand it to him immediately. She held it between them, a heavy piece of history. "If you pull this thread, Mr. Crowe, the whole city might unravel. People in very high places are counting on the Aurelia Grand to bury these ghosts forever. They won't let a man with a limp and a tablet stand in the way of a billion-dollar legacy." "I'm not here to stop the hotel, Mrs. Vance," Crowe said, gently taking the key. "I'm here to finish the inspection Julian Vane started 27 years ago. I'm here to make sure the load is finally balanced." As they walked back to the car, Crowe felt the cold weight of the key in his palm. He looked back at the house, seeing Martha Vance watching them from behind the velvet curtains. "She's terrified," Elena said, starting the engine. "She's been living in a tomb," Crowe replied, his eyes fixed on the city skyline, where the Aurelia Grand's cranes were visible even through the storm. But Julian Vane didn't just leave a map in the concrete or a voice in a server. He left a paper trail that Thorne couldn't burn. "We just found the key to the senator's private basement. Where to now?" Crowe looked at the key, then at his watch. "The senator is hosting a founders gala tonight to celebrate the final concrete pour for the hotel. It's a celebration of the clean start. I think it's time we showed him that his foundation is sitting on quicksand." Chapter 5. The Red Ink. The gala for the Aurelia Grand was a masterclass in performative forgetting. It was held in the penthouse of the Glass Spire, a building that offered a panoramic view of the city's reconstruction. From this height, the massive excavation pit where the Summit Plaza had once stood looked like a clean geometric abstraction rather than a site of mass trauma. Inside, the air was a curated blend of expensive floral arrangements, vintage champagne, and the crisp, sterile scent of high-efficiency climate control. Senator Elias Thorne was the sun in this particular solar system. He was a man crafted for high-definition television. Silver hair swept back in a style that suggested both wisdom and vitality, and a laugh that seemed to resonate at a frequency designed to inspire trust. He had spent 27 years branding himself as the architect of resilience, the man who had pulled the city out of the rubble of 1999. Bennett Crowe did not belong in this room, and he made no effort to pretend otherwise. His suit was a charcoal wool that had been tailored for a man he used to be, and his presence was a jagged edge in a room full of smooth surfaces. As he moved across the polished marble floor, his right leg produced a rhythmic, discordant thump click that drew the subtle, judging glances of the city's elite. "Thorn has 3 layers of private security," Elena whispered, staying close to his shoulder. She looked elegant in a dark cocktail dress, but her eyes were darting toward the exits. "And that man by the pillar, the one who looks like he's made of granite, that's Miller, Thorn's chief of staff. He's been watching us since we stepped off the elevator. He knows you aren't on the donor list." "Let him watch," Crowe said, his voice a low, dry rasp. A man who watches everyone is usually afraid that someone is watching him. It's a reciprocal fear. Crowe ignored the circling trays of hors d'oeuvres and headed directly for the center of the room. There, under a museum-grade plexiglass dome, sat a pristine architectural model of the new hotel. It was a masterpiece of miniature engineering, showing the Aurelia Grand as a shimmering tower of light. But Crowe wasn't looking at the aesthetics. He was looking at the technical specifications etched into the brass plaque beside it. "Look at the engineering firm," Crowe noted, leaning in until his breath fogged the glass. "Vance Engineering. It was supposed to have been dissolved after Arthur Vance died 3 years ago. But the corporate metadata tells a different story. It was absorbed by a shell company called Apex Foundations. It's the same team, Elena, the same hands that poured the dead spot in 1999 are pouring the foundation for Thorn's legacy today." He pulled out his tablet, shielded by the crook of his arm, and opened the blue ink blueprints he had recovered from Martha Vance. He ran a real-time overlay of the 1999 graft map against the new Aurelia Grand schematics. "The theft wasn't just in the cheap steel," Crowe murmured. "The 1999 blueprints show a massive rerouting of the city's fiber optic trunk. Thorn didn't just rebuild the site. He converted it into a private data hub. Julian Vane discovered that the Summit Plaza wasn't failing because of a design flaw. It was being cleared to make room for a digital infrastructure that would make Thorn a billionaire before he ever ran for the Senate. Vane was killed because he realized the tragedy was actually a real estate strategy." "Mr. Crowe, I presume?" The voice was like velvet over gravel. Senator Elias Thorn stood behind them, a glass of amber scotch in his hand. He didn't look threatened. He looked like a landlord who had found a squatter in his penthouse. "Senator," Crowe said, not turning around. He kept his eyes on the model. "I was just admiring the foundation. It's remarkably deep. I was wondering if you find it difficult to build on top of so much history, or if the concrete acts as a natural soundproofing for the ghosts." Thorn's smile didn't falter, but the skin around his eyes tightened into a web of sharp lines. He stepped up beside Crowe, smelling of expensive tobacco and calculated poise. "You have a reputation for finding ghosts where there are only shadows, Bennett. But this city has moved on. We don't dig up the past here. We build over it. That's what progress is." "That's the problem with concrete, Senator," Crowe said, finally turning to face him. His eyes were cold and analytical, stripping away Thorn's political mask. "It doesn't breathe, but it does hold a signature. I spent some time at the site last night. I found Julian Vane's mark on a steel piling. He didn't flee to South America in 1999. He was entombed in the foundation he designed. He was used as a structural reinforcement for your secrets." The air between them chilled, a sudden vacuum of sound in the middle of the crowded gala. Thorn leaned in, his voice dropping into a lethal, private register. "You're playing with a blueprint you don't understand, Mr. Crowe. If you stop the Aurelia project, you aren't just hurting me. You're hurting the thousands of people who need this growth, this hope. Do you really want to be the man who kills the city's future because of a 27-year-old clerical error?" "I'm not interested in the future," Crowe said, his deadpan delivery cutting through Thorn's charisma like a scalpel. "And I'm not interested in hope. I'm interested in the load-bearing capacity of the truth. And right now, Senator, your floor is looking dangerously thin. I'd be careful where I stepped if I were you." Thorne's eyes flickered to Miller, who began to move toward them with the silent intent of a shark. "Enjoy the view while you can, Bennett. It's the highest you'll ever get in this town." Crowe didn't wait for Miller to arrive. He turned to Alina and nodded toward the elevators. "The senator is right about one thing," Crowe said as they walked away. "The view is revealing, but he's wrong about the concrete. It doesn't just hide things. It preserves them until someone with the right tools comes along to break it open." As the elevator doors closed, Crowe pulled out the leather-bound ledger he had hidden under his coat, the one he'd snatched from the display during the distraction. It wasn't just a prop. It was the red ink log for the original Summit Plaza. "Now," Crowe said, his voice tight with focus, "let's go see what else the senator is afraid of digging up." Chapter 6. The Weight of Evidence. The exit from the senator's gala was less of a departure and more of a tactical retreat. By the time they reached the ground floor, the humid night air felt like a physical weight against Crowe's chest. He didn't wait for the valet. He led Elena toward the parked sedan, with a pace that pushed his injured leg to its limit. "We can't go back to the office," Crowe said, his voice tight as he slid into the passenger seat. "Miller didn't just look at us. He appraised us. By the time we reach the city limits, he'll have a sanitization crew at my door. They'll seize the servers, burn the physical files, and leave a gas leak as an explanation." "Then where?" Elena asked, her hands trembling as she ignited the engine. The car's headlights cut through the relentless rain, illuminating the oily slick of the asphalt. "If Thorne owns the police and the builders, there isn't a safe house in the state." "The records annex," Crowe directed, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "It's a brutalist concrete fortress on the edge of the industrial docks. The city sends its paperwork there to die. It's where the files live when they are too legally sensitive to destroy, but too embarrassing to digitize. It's the city's basement, and nobody visits the basement in a storm." They drove in a tense silence, the neon lights of the city fading into the rusted, salt-crusted silhouettes of the shipyard. The records annex was a windowless cube of stained gray stone, surrounded by a perimeter of sagging chain-link fence. It looked more like a tomb than a library. Crowe bypassed the electronic gate using a handheld signal duplicator, a device that mimicked the frequency of a night shift supervisor's fob. Inside, the air was a stale mixture of dust, damp paper, and the slow, acidic decay of old ink. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thump-click of Crowe's stride echoing off the high, narrow corridors of metal shelving. "The red ink Martha mentioned," Crowe said, pulling a massive leather-bound ledger from a shelf labeled Zoning and Infrastructure, 1998-2000. He laid it out on a metal reading table, the sound of the heavy cover hitting the surface like a gunshot in the quiet room. In the days before total digitization, city surveyors used red ink to mark provisional changes, the kind of alterations that weren't authorized by the city council yet, but were expected to happen by the higher-ups. He flipped through the yellowed, brittle pages, his eyes scanning the columns with the speed of a man used to finding needles in haystacks. He found the entry for October 14th, 1999. "Look at this," Crowe pointed, his finger tracing a jagged crimson line. "The red ink shows a seismic vibration test scheduled for exactly 10 a.m. on the day of the collapse. The test was authorized directly by Elias Thorne's office, bypassing the standard safety board. They used a high-output sonic pile driver on the lot immediately adjacent to the Summit Plaza. They triggered it," Elena whispered, her face pale under the flickering fluorescent lights of the archive. "They knew the building was structurally compromised by the hollow steel they'd swapped in. They didn't need explosives. They just needed to shake the earth at the right frequency, until the building's resonance did the work for them. It was a legal murder. But they missed one thing," Crowe said. He pulled a magnifying glass from his kit and hovered over a faint smudge in the margin of the log, a series of numbers that didn't belong in a zoning ledger. Julian Vane wasn't just an architect. He was an amateur seismologist. He'd set up a private, independent recorder in the basement to monitor the settling of his foundation. If that recorder survived, it caught the specific mechanical signature of Thorne's pile driver. It's the smoking gun, Elena. It's the proof that the collapse was rhythmic, not random. Crowe's phone chirped a low-frequency alert. He had been running a background search on Julian Vane's estate assets during the drive. Vane's recorder wasn't in the rubble because he'd rigged it to broadcast the data in real time to a remote receiver. He used a packet radio station at the old North Point lighthouse. His family owned the keeper's cottage for 3 generations. The city seized the land for a public park, but they never tore down the radio tower. As they turned to leave, the heavy metal door at the end of the aisle creaked open with a groan of protesting hinges. A tall, broad silhouette stood in the frame, flanked by 2 men in dark, waterproof coats. The light from the hallway behind them cast long, predatory shadows down the aisle. It was Miller, Thorne's chief of staff. He wasn't wearing his gala tuxedo anymore. He wore a tactical jacket, and in his hand was a suppressed handgun. "The senator was right about you, Crowe," Miller said, his voice echoing with a chilling, flat resonance. "You really don't know when to stop digging. Some things are buried for the safety of the city. You're trying to tear down a skyscraper with a shovel." Crowe didn't flinch. He tucked the leather-bound ledger under his arm and stepped into the center of the aisle, placing himself between Miller and Elena. "I've always had a problem with unfinished structures, Miller," Crowe said, his voice as steady as the concrete walls around them. "And this case is about to reach its topping-out ceremony. You can't kill a ghost, and Julian Vane has been speaking to me all night." Miller raised the weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Crowe was already moving. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled a high-intensity magnesium flare from his pocket, a tool from his forensic kit, and struck it against the edge of the metal shelving. The archive erupted in a blinding, chemical white light that seared the darkness. Miller and his men cried out, shielding their eyes from the thermal bloom. "Go!" Crowe shouted, grabbing Elena's arm. They vanished into the thick, acrid smoke and the labyrinth of the tall shelves. The chase was no longer a matter of digital forensics. It was a race through the dark toward the North Point lighthouse, where the last witness of 1999, a spinning reel of magnetic tape, waited to finally tell its story. Chapter 7. The Keeper's Frequency. The drive to North Point was a descent into the city's forgotten periphery, a stretch of coastline where the luxury high-rises gave way to rusted shipping containers and salt-bleached scrubland. The rain had intensified, turning the coastal road into a black ribbon of hydroplaning hazards. Behind them, the headlights of Miller's SUVs were twin needles of light, stitching through the darkness with predatory intent. "They aren't going to pull us over, Bennett," Elena said, her knuckles white as she wrestled the steering wheel against a sudden gust of wind that threatened to shove the car into the oncoming lane. "They're waiting for a curve sharp enough to make a fatal accident look like a tragedy of bad weather. They don't want a shootout. They want a headline about a reckless investigator." "Physics favors the heavy, but the brave control the momentum," Crowe said, his eyes fixed on the GPS overlay on his tablet, which was currently fighting for a signal. "Take the next service road. It's unpaved, silt-heavy, and prone to washouts. Their vehicles are armored, which means they've got an extra 1,000 pounds of steel plating. They're too heavy for the soft shoulders of the cliffside. We're going to let the earth do the work for us." Elena swerved, the tires screaming as they transitioned from asphalt to a treacherous slurry of mud and sea salt. Behind them, the lead SUV attempted to follow the line, but its massive weight worked against it. The edge of the road gave way, and the heavy vehicle slid sideways, its headlights sweeping uselessly across the crashing waves below, before it bogged down to its axles in the muck. The North Point lighthouse appeared through the fog like a ghost, a crumbling finger of granite pointing at a blind, indifferent sky. It had been decommissioned in the late 80s, its manual Fresnel lens replaced by the cold efficiency of GPS and satellite radar. Yet, the radio tower beside it remained, a skeletal spire of rusted iron that hummed in the wind like a tuning fork. They reached the keeper's cottage, a shell of a building reclaimed by salt air and creeping ivy. Crowe didn't head for the shelter of the ruins. He headed for the base of the tower, his limp more pronounced as he navigated the slick, jagged rocks that lined the path. Every step was a battle against the slick moss and the biting cold of the spray. Vane was a man of redundancies, Crowe muttered, shielding his tablet from the relentless spray of the surf. He knew the city would eventually seize his office assets. He knew they'd scrub his hard drives and intimidate his staff, but no one looks at a dead radio tower in a condemned park. He used a trickle-charged solar array on the south face. It's low voltage, just enough to keep a solid-state buffer alive for decades without attracting a power surge alert. He found the junction box, hidden behind a rusted plate, marked with that same missing pedal compass rose. He didn't use a key. He used a burst from a portable capacitor to fry the solenoid and pop the door open. Inside, a single green LED blinked, a heartbeat in the dark. If this works, we don't just get the seismic data, Crowe said, his voice tightening as he plugged in his interface. Packet radio in the late 90s was notorious for crosstalk. It picked up electromagnetic bleed from the city's early digital trunk lines. If Thorne was on his mobile phone within 2 miles of the site on the day of the collapse, this tower might have caught the digital echo of his conversation. The screen pulsed with life. A green line began to scroll, a digital record of a day the city thought it had buried. "It's here," Crowe whispered. "October 14th, 1999, 10:02 a.m. Look at the vibration spikes. That's not a tectonic shift or an accidental settling. It's a rhythmic, mechanical pulse at exactly 120 beats per minute, the exact operating frequency of an industrial sonic pile driver. It's the sound of the building being shaken apart by design." And then, a second stream of data appeared. It was a string of intercepted text from a primitive pager network, reconstructed by Crowe's modern software. Intercepted signal, mobile unit 09. Sender, E. Thorne. Recipient, A. Vance. The message was brief. A death warrant, written in the cold shorthand of a bureaucrat. "Go for southwest. Dust by noon. Vane handled." "Vane handled," Elena read aloud, her voice trembling as the reality of the words settled in. "They didn't just kill the building, Bennett. They bragged about disposing of a human being like he was a waste product." "They didn't brag," Crowe corrected, his voice as cold as the iron tower they stood beneath. "They documented. In their world, a murder is just another line item in a budget. They never thought anyone would have the patience to read the fine print 3 decades later." A car door slammed nearby, the sound sharp enough to cut through the roar of the ocean. A high-intensity handheld spotlight hit the tower, blinding them in a cage of white light. Miller had abandoned his bogged-down vehicle and come for them on foot. He stood at the edge of the cottage ruins, silhouetted by the rain, and for the first time, Crowe saw the shadow of a gun in the man's hand. "That's enough, Crowe." Miller's voice carried over the wind, flat and final. "You've found the frequency. Now it's time for the silence." Chapter 8. The Load-Bearing Truth. Miller didn't come with a speech or a warrant. He came with the quiet, terrifying confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades burying the senator's mistakes in the deep foundations of the city. He stood at the edge of the cottage ruins, the rain lashing against his tactical jacket, his silenced pistol looking less like a weapon and more like a tool of his trade. "Step away from the box, Bennett," Miller said. His voice was steady, devoid of the panic that usually preceded a confrontation. He was a man who understood structural integrity. He knew when a situation had reached its breaking point. The senator is a pragmatist. He's willing to forget the archive. He's willing to forget the lighthouse. But that data stays here. It dies with the tower, or you die with it. Either way, the ledger is balanced. Crowe stood his ground, the tablet tucked firmly under his arm. He could feel the vibration of the radio tower behind him, a low-frequency hum that seemed to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. Elena was behind him, her phone held high, the lens focused on Miller. She was shaking, but she wasn't backing down. "You're a structural man, Miller," Crowe said, his tone conversational, almost academic. He leaned slightly against the rusted iron, shifting the weight off his bad leg. You know that once a crack reaches the foundation, the collapse isn't just a possibility. It's a mathematical certainty. You can kill us, but you can't kill the signal. I've already initiated a dead man sync. The moment this tablet loses my biometric signature, or the connection is severed, every major news outlet in the state gets an encrypted copy of the vein-handled memo. It was a bluff. The lighthouse's uplink was a relic, a stuttering connection that would take 20 minutes to upload a file of that size in a storm this heavy. But Crowe spoke with the absolute weight of a man who had already seen the end of the movie. Miller's aim wavered. He looked at the tablet, then at the blinking green LED in the junction box. He was calculating the risk, weighing the senator's orders against the reality of a digital leak he couldn't stop. "You're lying," Miller said, but the conviction was leaking out of his voice like water through a cracked dam. "You didn't have enough time to establish a handshake with the city's old node." "Am I?" Crowe asked, taking a slow, measured step forward. His limp was pronounced, a rhythmic hitch that served as a countdown. "Check your own phone, Miller. Your office is already getting pings from the server I tripped in the city annex. The red ink is public. The seismic logs are live. The Aurelia Grand isn't a luxury hotel anymore. It's a tombstone for Elias Thorne's career. And you? You're just the man standing next to it when the roof caves in." Miller's thumb twitched on the grip of the pistol. For a second, the only sound was the roar of the Pacific and the whistle of the wind through the tower's iron lattice. He knew Crowe was right about the logic, even if he suspected the bluff. In the world of high-stakes corruption, the first one to realize the structure is failing is the only one who survives the fall. In the distance, the low, guttural hum of a different siren began to rise. Not the private security of the senator, but the state police. Elena had used her firm's emergency channel to bypass the local precinct, bringing in the one force Thorne couldn't control with a campaign contribution. The blue and red lights began to refract through the fog, turning the mist into a kaleidoscopic nightmare. Miller looked at the road, then back at Crowe. He saw the inevitable geometry of the collapse. He didn't fire. A man who specializes in demolitions knows when the charges have already been set. He turned and ran toward the cliffside path, hoping to vanish into the darkness of the coastal scrub, but he was met by the blinding glare of high beams and the command of a loudspeaker. Crowe leaned back against the rusted iron of the tower, the adrenaline fading into a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that made his vision swim. He felt the cold spray of the ocean on his face, washing away the grit of the archive. "Is it over?" Elena asked, her voice breaking as she lowered her phone. She looked at him, her face a mask of terror and relief. "The discovery phase is over," Crowe said, his voice a soft, dry rasp. He looked out at the dark, churning water of the Pacific, where the lighthouse once guided ships away from the rocks. "Now comes the demolition, and God help anyone standing too close to the senator when the dust starts to settle. It's a long way down from the penthouse." He looked at the tablet one last time. The green line of the seismic pulse was still scrolling. The voice of Julian Vane, finally being heard after 27 years of silence. The data was saved. The ghost had done its job. "Let's go, Elena," Crowe said, pushing himself off the tower. "I need a coffee, and it needs to be very, very black." Chapter 9. The Final Inspection. The arrest of Senator Elias Thorne was not the loud, dramatic affair the public expected. It didn't happen on a debate stage or in front of a bank of news cameras. It happened in the quiet, mahogany-scented vacuum of his private office at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday. The evidence Crowe had unearthed, the red ink ledgers, the seismic logs from the North Point Tower, and the intercepted pager data had acted like a slow-acting poison in the senator's political veins. By the time the state authorities arrived, the structure of his power had already hollowed out. But for Bennett Crowe, the case wasn't closed just because a man in an expensive suit had been fingerprinted. A building collapse is never just about the person who signed the check. It is about the physical reality left behind in the dirt. 5 days after the lighthouse confrontation, Crowe returned to the Aurelia Grand construction site. The city had issued a total stop work order. The massive yellow cranes stood frozen against the gray sky, like prehistoric birds of prey, and the constant roar of machinery had been replaced by a hollow, haunting silence. "You shouldn't be here, Bennett," Elena said, stepping out of her car to join him at the edge of the excavation pit. She looked exhausted, her role in the investigation having put her firm in the crosshairs of a dozen legal battles. "The site is under state jurisdiction now. Forensics is crawling all over the southwest quadrant." "I'm not here for the forensics," Crowe said, his gaze fixed on the dead spot at the bottom of the pit. "I'm here for the final inspection. Forensic teams look for evidence. I'm looking for the man." He led her down the temporary stairs one last time. His limp was a dull, persistent reminder of the physical cost of his obsession. But his eyes were sharp, scanning the layers of exposed earth and concrete. At the bottom, a heavy-duty diamond wire saw was being operated by a state recovery team. They were cutting through the massive slab of polymer-reinforced concrete, the vault that Crowe had identified. "Julian Vane was a meticulous man," Crowe murmured as the saw shrieked against the high-density aggregate. He knew that if he ran, Thorne would frame him. He knew that if he stayed, Thorne would kill him. He realized that the only way to protect the truth was to become a part of the architecture itself. The saw finally cut through the final internal rebar. A massive crane hummed to life, slowly lifting the 6-ton slab of vault concrete away from the foundation. As the stone rose, it revealed a hidden reinforced void, a small chamber that had been designed into the very blueprints Julian Vane had claimed were flawed. Inside the chamber, protected from the weight of the collapse and the dampness of the earth by a double-walled lead lining, sat a small, waterproof briefcase, and beside it, resting in the quiet dark of the last 27 years, were the remains of Julian Vane. The recovery workers went silent. Elena turned away, her hand over her mouth. Crowe stepped forward, his boots crunching on the loose gravel. He looked down at the architect. Vane hadn't been murdered in a dark alley or pushed from a height. He had crawled into the foundation of his own masterpiece, knowing he was trapped. He had spent his final hours ensuring that the evidence wouldn't just be hidden. It would be protected by the very building that was meant to be his tomb. "He didn't just leave a record," Crowe said, his voice a soft, dry rasp that carried a rare note of reverence. "He built a safe for it. He knew that eventually, the greed that built the city would require someone to dig deep enough to find him." One of the forensic officers carefully opened the briefcase. Inside was the original, untampered ledger of every kickback Elias Thorne had ever taken, documented with the precision only an obsessed architect could provide. But on top of the files was a single, hand-drawn blueprint on vellum, yellowed but intact. It wasn't a building. It was a map of the city's heart, with a final note written in the margin in Vane's elegant, precise hand. "To the one who looks at the edges, make them remember that the foundation is only as strong as the hands that pour it." "He knew you'd come," Elena whispered, looking back into the pit. "No," Crowe said, his gaze lingering on the man who had been a ghost in his machine for so long. "He just knew that the truth is the only material with a high enough density to survive the fall." He banked on the physics of justice. As the recovery team began the grim task of removing the remains, Crowe climbed back up to the surface. He felt the weight of the case lifting, replaced by a cold, clear clarity. The architect was no longer a coward or a fugitive. He was the anchor. "What happens to the site now?" Elena asked as they reached the perimeter fence. "They'll tear it all out," Crowe said. "You can't build on top of a lie once the truth has been excavated. The structure is compromised." He looked at the city, the lights beginning to flicker on in the gathering twilight. For the first time in his career, the ache in his leg felt like a badge of honor rather than a burden. He had finished the inspection. "Come on," Crowe said, turning toward his car. "There's a small place 3 blocks over that serves the worst coffee in the city. I think I've earned a cup." Chapter 10. The Unfinished City. The Aurelia Grand was never built. Following the discovery of Julian Vane's remains and the subsequent tidal wave of indictments that swept through City Hall, the project was permanently halted. The site, once a jagged wound of greed and ambition, was eventually turned into a memorial park. It became a rare green space in the center of the glass and steel, a quiet hollow dedicated to the 11 victims of the 1999 collapse and the architect who had waited 27 years to tell the truth. Bennett Crowe sat on a wrought iron bench in the center of the park, his coat collar turned up against a biting wind that smelled of the coming winter. In his hand was a paper cup of black coffee, steam rising in a thin, disappearing ribbon. Beside him, a small portable speaker played a low, mournful Miles Davis trumpet solo, the notes drifting through the trees and mixing with the distant hum of traffic. The park was designed with a specific geometry. In the center, where the dead spot had once been, was a bronze fountain. A compass rose with all its petals intact. Water flowed over the metal, shimmering under the pale autumn sun. It was a structure built not to dominate the skyline, but to ground the earth. Elena Marquez sat down beside him, her heels clicking against the stone pavers. She looked different, younger perhaps, or simply lighter. The weight of the investigation had transitioned into the routine of the aftermath. "The senator's final appeal was denied this morning," she said, her voice steady. "The vein-handled memo was the anchor they couldn't cut. 25 to life, and Miller took a plea deal. He's talking to the Attorney General about the telecom kickbacks from 2005. The whole house of cards is finally coming down." Crowe didn't look up immediately. He was watching a young girl toss a handful of coins into the fountain. The problem with houses of cards is that they look impressive until the first breeze hits them. They have no core, no structural integrity. "The city feels different, Bennett," Elena said, looking toward the shimmering glass of the new financial district. "It feels cleaner, like we finally lanced a fever." "The city is a structure, Elena," Crowe said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "It's alive, in its own way. It's only as strong as the people who maintain the joints and check the stress points. We just did a little overdue maintenance. We cleared the rust." He stood up, his joints protesting with the familiar dull ache. His limp was a permanent part of his stride now, a signature of his own history and the cases that had left their mark on him. He didn't look back at the fountain or the plaque that bore Julian Vane's name. He had never been a man for monuments. He was a man for the data that lived beneath them. "Where to now, Bennett?" Elena asked, standing with him. "My firm just got a call from the valley, a vanished land surveyor from the mid-'80s. The family found some old field notes in an attic that don't match the official county maps." Crowe paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the horizon, where the digital trails of the past were always waiting to be rediscovered. A vanished surveyor, inconsistent field notes, the scent of a discrepancy was already beginning to sharpen in his mind. "The surveyor," Crowe murmured, a faint, observant glint returning to his eyes. "I heard a rumor about that case once. They say he was a man who liked to work in red ink. He was obsessed with the easements that shouldn't exist." He began to walk toward the park exit, the rhythm of his step, thump, click, fading into the ambient noise of the city. The Blackridge case was closed. The secret was out, and for the first time in nearly 3 decades, the blueprints for the city's heart were finally complete. Bennett Crowe was already looking for the next crack in the foundation. He knew that out there, in the shadows of the skyscrapers and the silence of the archives, there was always another story waiting for someone with the patience to listen to the stone. "The red ink," Crowe repeated, his voice a soft rasp of anticipation. "Let's go see if he left a map." End of chapter and end of story. Please like and subscribe to support our channel and to listen to more free audiobooks.